My name's Eddie Winters. You're tuned in to the Rock and Roll Coup d'etat. It brings me to this next segment. I'm so excited. On the line, all the way from England, we've got none other than Bill Harry. Bill, are you with us?
Yes, I am, Eddie. How are you?
I'm doing fantastic. It is a distinct honor to have you on the program. I've got some applause there for you. Thank you so much. We're joined. Our co-host Bodie Lane is here, and we have been talking about you all morning. I hope your ears have not been burning too bad.
Right. Yeah.
I just wanted to. I just wanted to thank you for coming on the program, Bill. You've had such an amazing career, and I'm so excited to be able to talk to you about it. You are, I have to say, probably, dare I say, probably one of the the coolest person I've ever heard about, read about.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely.
You've had a crazy career. Just for our audience's sake, let's go back real quick. Just to start things off, you grew up in Liverpool, England, and you went to art college and started to get into not only art but also journalism, and thus creating Mersey Beat, the famous weekly paper back in 1961. Can you take us back to Liverpool Art College and tell us a little bit of how you got into just doing journalism, doing the writing, and how music kind of crept in with that?
Oh, sure. When I was a sort of kid, I was a member of the Liverpool Science Fiction Society. And I used to illustrate and write for fan magazines in America, Europe and Britain, and I published my own fan magazine called Biped, and so I was really into the world of science fiction. And when I went to junior art college, I asked them if they had a magazine, and they said no, and I said I want to start one, so I started one called Premier. Then I went to the main art college, and I started one there just called Jazz. And then the Liverpool University asked me if I could edit a magazine for them called Panther Sphinx. And then one of the local music shops in Liverpool, Frank Hesse, who sold the guitars to the Beatles and all the other groups, they asked me to edit a magazine called Frank Comments about the music on Liverpool. And then eventually I borrowed £50 and started Mersey Beat.
And started Mersey Beat, and at the time, that was 1961. The Liverpool scene had just been exploding with bands,
but nobody knew about it.
Yeah,
they only knew about it through Mersey Beat because it was like an underground scene in Liverpool. I mean, basically, when I went to the art college, I was hearing buzz about a very talented guy called Stuart Sutcliffe, so I got to know him.
Right.
And we became friends, him and his other friend, Rod Murray. And then I was sitting in the college canteen one day, and I saw this strange character walk past, and he was dressed like a teddy boy. He was completely different from everybody else around, who were all like standard art students with duffel coats and things.
Right.
But he's just, and I thought, I've got to know him. You know, he's different. He's the rebel. They're all conventionalists in this place. So I took him over to our local pub, The Crack, and introduced him to Stuart and Rod, and the four of us called ourselves the Dissenters, and we all made a vow to make Liverpool famous. John would do it with his music, Stuart and Rod with the painting, and I'd do it with my writing.
Wow. And nonetheless, that just started right off. That was
exactly what you did.
Exactly what you set out to do.
Right.
It's amazing. Now, I mean, because of so many years have passed since that era, people like Stuart Sutcliffe, it goes into the mythology because Stuart died so early on. Could you give us your impression of Stuart when you met Stuart he was a promising artist and a great painter? What was your impression of him? What drew you to him?
Well, straight away, what drew me immediately, I saw this painting of his in the entrance to the college, and I was immediately struck by it. And once we became friends, I used to go to Stuart's flat, little flat he had in Mersey Street, and we used to talk about all kinds of things. He was into Kierkegaard, the philosopher, and everything. We used to talk about the future and what would happen. And I'd got a job during the vacation knocking down a mill across the water, and with my first pay packet I bought a blue jacket, and I went round to see Stuart at his studio, his flat, and he said, I like the jacket, and I said, well, you can have it if you do a painting of me. And he said, how would you like it? I said, I like Vincent van Gogh. And so he got down all these big pieces of pink paper and started drawing me, and then he got the painting going, and he did the whole sort of painting of me in that afternoon, and I've still got it in the wall in the house now.
Wow, that is amazing to have a Stuart Sutcliffe original of yourself.
Well, I've got the other one was when after Stuart had died, he hadn't seen the family or Stuart's mother at all, and I went to the Empire Theatre, grabbed hold of John and said, right, I'm taking you around to see Stuart's mother. You know, she's not seen or heard of you since Stuart has died.
Right.
So I took him along to Millie's house, and she was so thrilled. She took us all around the flat, and Stuart's paintings were everywhere, on the walls, under the beds, in cupboards. And she said to me and John, you know, pick whatever you want. You know, you're welcome to take one of Stuart's originals. So John picked a blue abstract, and I picked a red collage he'd done in Hamburg, and I've still got that on the wall.
Wow, what a amazing time. I mean, that's before you. How old were you when you first met John and Stu?
That would be 1958.
Wow.
I'd be just around 20.
20 years old, and this is, as the story goes, Stuart had won some money from a art exhibition and went off to buy a Hofner bass by the guidance of John Lennon. Were you aware of the booking at that time for the Beatles to go off to Germany? What was your impression of that?
Well, I booked it first. I mean,
is that right?
What happened was that Stuart had done this big painting. What had happened? John had asked Rod Murray and Stuart for either of them to be the bass player. He didn't just pick Stuart. He said either of them. If they needed a bass player, and would they come up with a bass? So Rod started making a bass guitar.
Wow.
But then Stuart had this painting, had this big long painting. It was so big that they cut the painting in half, and him and Rod carried it down to the Walker Art Gallery, and the organizer of the exhibition was so impressed by it, John Moores, that he gave Stuart 60 quid for it.
Wow.
So Stuart didn't actually use all that money to buy a guitar. He put a deposit down and got the guitar. And of course, Rod, who had been making a bass guitar, was now beaten by Stuart. So Stuart became the bass guitarist instead of Rod. And Rod still has that bass guitar that he started making.
Did he complete the bass?
Pardon?
Did he ever complete finishing the bass?
Yes, he's got it now, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
And so we started booking the group at our college dances, and Stuart, on the first dance, I was backstage with them, and Stuart said, here's my new guitar. So he gave it to me, and I started plucking the strings, and suddenly it was all blood all over the place because I'd taken all the skin off my fingers with it.
Right, right.
And we used to book them for our college dances. And Stuart and I and Rod were on the Students' Union committee, and we used Students' Union funds. Me and Stuart proposed and seconded that we use the funds to buy PA equipment which they could use.
Right.
So they started using the PA equipment at our dances, and then they took it, and the college never ever saw it again.
So they take it off to Germany. Is that how the story goes?
That's right. Yes, they took that PA equipment, and of course when they signed to Brian Epstein, Brian phoned up the college Fred O'Brien was the president then of the union, and he said, "Oh, the Beatles, for old time's sake, they'll like to come and play at a college dance,
Right.
And just for the nominal sum of £5." And Fred said, "We're not having them here ever again because they stole our PA equipment and never returned it."
Wow. And with the Beatles, as they were going off, getting started before going to Germany, they didn't have necessarily a drummer to fill that role, and they knew Pete best from his mother's club that they ran. How was the group before they?
That was later on. They had they got Tommy Moore to play drums with them.
Right.
And after sort of Tommy Moore, they got another drummer for a short time because he was okay to play and stay with them, but he was called up for the last bit of national service. At the time, all young people had to join the army for 2 years, called national service, and that was coming for an end. And Norman Chapman, who actually played drums with the Beatles and was going to be a member of the Beatles, was called up and was sent away. So
Wow.
he lost out on that.
Right.
And of course, then they got Pete.
And it's interesting to know from a lot of accounts. Pete had he was the mean, moody, and magnificent Pete Best. He had such a magnetic drawl to him. And did that when you think about the Beatles before they went off to Germany, the sound of them? How would you describe that sound pre-Germany?
Well, before they went to Germany, nobody reckoned them at all.
Right.
I mean, I was one of the few people who'd been listening to them all the time after booking them at our college dances. And also, we all used to go to the Jacaranda Coffee Bar,
right.
And then they'd play downstairs. And they hardly had any money. We didn't have two halfpennies to rattle together. And they used to be there. It was like a coal hole. It was a small room below the Jacaranda, a brick room with stone flooring. And they used to be in the corner, and they used to have Dot and Cynthia sitting in front of them on chairs, holding broom handles to which the mics were attached, because we couldn't even afford mic stands
Wow.
or anything.
That is amazing. And then they get the call to go and work in Germany, and then of course they're playing 6-7 nights a week.
Yeah.
And how long was that initial the initial trip to Germany? Was a few months.
That was around 3 months.
Right, and so they must have obviously. That was the boot camp. They come back and they must have been transformed into rock and roll machines at that point.
Yes, they were. People couldn't believe it. I called it their baptism of fire.
Right.
And when they came back, they developed what went around as the atom beat.
Right.
We called it, And they'd first appeared at the Casbah when they returned, but at Litherland Town Hall, it was about the 28th of December, 1960, and that was the gig that changed everything in Liverpool. They appeared on that gig, and the people were just amazed. All the kids went right up to the stage. They'd never heard sound like it before. We had so many groups, and we had fantastic groups there, but it was quite unique when they came back from Germany. They were completely transformed.
And did you share some intimate moments with them? As were they surprised or taken aback by the response when they came back?
Only slightly, because despite this impact they made, they still didn't have much work.
Right.
And in fact, Mona Best, Pete's mother, did extra gigs at places like Notty Ash Village Hall to give them some work and some money and increase their fees and things,
Right.
But as a result of that gig at Litherland Town Hall, Brian Kelly, the promoter, immediately gave them about 36 bookings, and Dave Forshaw, another promoter, started promoting them. So they started doing these sort of gigs. remember, at this particular time, there were groups who were playing at church halls, synagogues, schools,
right,
cinemas, swimming baths, ice rinks, everywhere. Every place in Liverpool just had sort of groups, hundreds and hundreds of groups, you know?
Absolutely, just incredible. I mean, just a scene just blowing up with talent and kids everywhere, starting bands. And it's so interesting at the point that you're doing the Mersey Beat. You're covering these groups, and obviously the Beatles kind of keep creeping up towards the top because they had the most momentum. What was that scene like when they come back from Germany and they had they I guess later on recorded with Tony Sheridan to record By Bonnie? That was like the first excitement to really hit Liverpool. A Liverpool group had a record.
No, they were a bit latecomers on that.
Is that right?
Mal Perry had his records released from 1958. He was a guy who went to Quarrybank School, and he wrote songs. And John Lennon admired him and thought, oh, God, you're a songwriter. I'd love to become a songwriter, you know? And Mel Perry got a recording contract, and John was extremely impressed. In fact, so much so that he offered Mel Perry, I think it was Please Please Me, and Mel Perry said, no, I wouldn't record that. It's crap.
Wow.
And then, of course, there was Billy Fury from Liverpool, was the biggest rock and roll star in England at the time. And then the first real group from Liverpool to make an impact on record was Howie Casey and the Seniors. They were the first group to go to Hamburg before the Beatles.
Right.
And they recorded an album, Twist at the Top, and they recorded singles, you know? So, the recordings were before the Beatles made their records. And in fact, when they did back Tony Sheridan, they asked Bert Camford, we write songs, can we record one of our songs? So they played him some, and the only one he wanted, he didn't want a Lennon McCartney one, he picked George Harrison's Cry for a Shadow.
Right.
And that was the only original recording they made. So when I wrote all about the Beatles recording Hamburg, the entire front cover of issue number 2 in July 61, I put about George Harrison being the first Beatle to have a song recorded. But in actual fact, when they'd done a local recording at Phillips Studio in Kensington, Liverpool, they did a Buddy Holly number.
Right.
But they also did an original, In Spite of All the Danger, written by George Harrison and Paul McCartney.
Right.
So the first two recordings by the Beatles, one with George Harrison with a little help from John, which was recorded in Germany, and then the one George Harrison with Paul, which they did in Liverpool.
It's amazing to think too that George got the first two recording of his own pen tracks. He was the first to make it on record, and of course, for years later, he only had one track per album as they were more established. It's very interesting.
It was worse at the beginning, because when I'd get with them and be with George, and I said, look, why is it always Lennon McCartney? I said, what happened to your songwriting? And he was all a bit sort of embarrassed. I think he was a bit overawed by the two of them,
Right.
And I kept seeing him at clubs and things saying, listen, George, what about your writing? I said, if you haven't got the confidence to write yourself, do one with Ringo. And he actually wrote a number with Ringo. When I saw him again, he said, well, I've written this number. I don't think they ever recorded it, but I kept going on at him. So one day I was up in Blackpool with them, was sitting, and George says, oh, Bill, I want to thank you. And I said, what for? And he said, I've just got a cheque for over £7,000 because for the song. I said, what song? He said, well, one day I was coming out to go to a club at night, and I thought, oh, God, I'm going to see you, and you're going to be bothering me again about writing songs. So I thought of doing a song called Don't Bother Me.
Oh.
I said, thanks very much. I've made a lot of money out of it.
Is that right? You're the inspiration for that.
Such an influence over them.
That's a great story. And so, you mentioned the second issue of Mersey Beat.
Yes.
And that issue, very important, because that issue found its way to Brian Epstein's his store. And
he ordered 144 copies of that one issue. Now, the first issue, I'd gone into NEMS with issue number 1 in July 61 and talked him into taking a dozen. Then he phoned me and said, I can't believe they're all gone straight away. And then he ordered more, and they went. So he ordered 12 dozen copies of issue 2. The entire front cover was the Beatles recording Hamburg.
Wow.
And there's that picture of them in Hamburg in black leather right across the front page.
Right.
And so Brian called me in his office, went through all the pages, and he says, can I be your record reviewer? So he became my record reviewer in issue number 3.
Wow.
And I had all these articles on the Beatles because I plugged them more than anybody else. Bob Wooler, the Cavern DJ, came in the office and says, you're writing too much about the Beatles, that the people are beginning to call your paper the Mersey Beetle.
Right.
So I introduced a page called the Mersey Beetle.
Oh, that's funny.
And anyway, with Brian Epstein, became my record reviewer with issue number 3. He took me to lunch a couple of times to the Basnet bar, and wanted to go all over about the groups, in particular the Beatles, because they were the ones I was writing about. And on the full-page features on the Beatles, he took his adverts, the NEMS adverts, and then he asked me if I could arrange for him to go down the Cavern, which I did. And then suddenly, when he comes out with the book years later, he mentioned he'd never heard of them till a boy came into his shop.
Right.
And this was about 4 or 5 months after I'd been dealing with him, and he'd been writing for me and all the rest of it. And that's how, history has changed.
Right. And so, but he actually he called you up and actually he had you bring them in to the Cavern to see the Beatles for the first time.
Oh, sure. I mean, what had happened? I mean, Brian didn't want to go across the Cavern and stand in a queue with all the youngsters and pay a shilling at the door.
Right.
He had a prestige to accommodate him. So I phoned Ray McFall, who owned the Cavern, and said, look, Brian Epstein wants to come down, but he doesn't want to hustle at the door. So he said, that's fine. Pat Delaney at the door, I'll tell him. If Brian comes, you'll see Pat Delaney at the door, who will take him into the club. So I did that. So Brian went down with Alistair Taylor, his PA, saw Pat Delaney at the door, and he took them down, and they saw the Beatles that day.
Wow, and then his impression, obviously, that he had to work with them, and with the Beatles. I know that the old story is that they made the announcement that Brian Epstein was in the building prior to the Beatles, I guess, on stage before they took stage. Did they realize that this was a big to do?
Well, that was Bob Wooler did that because NEMS was the big music store, record store, just around the corner from the Cavern, about 100 yards away from the Cavern. And it was the disc jockey, Bob Wooler, who announced that Brian Epstein of NEMS had sort of was in the audience,
Right.
And, of course, the Beatles used to go to NEMS. After they did a lunchtime session at the Cavern, they'd go across the road to NEMS and listen to the records in the phone booths,
right.
in the record booths there, because they used to try and pick the B-sides of records, because everyone was competing with what kind of numbers that they'd perform on stage. I mean, in fact, on John's wedding night, they appeared on a gig in Chester with another group, the Remo 4. And when the Remo 4 started playing a number that the Beatles also played, John Lennon started to argue, but they told him where to get off.
Right.
Because they did compete for numbers in those days.
Of course.
Before the Beatles really got into their writing.
And so let's talk a little bit about, because I'm fascinated about the Beatles coming up and coming back to Liverpool and becoming this force. They had Pete Best as the drummer, and of course when Brian secured the gig at EMI to record. Most famously, Pete was replaced first by Alan White in the studio. Or Ringo, I'm sorry, and then Alan White and then Ringo actually got to record with him. Pete Best had a following. He was like he was the most popular Beatle at that time going into that.
Yes, he was the most popular sort of member of the Beatles in Liverpool, and what happened basically was this, and the real story's been so twisted because people didn't understand the recording industry in Britain. The A&R men in London always used lots of session drummers.
Right.
They didn't mind sort of, guitarists, singers, things like that, but they always liked for the studios to have special session drummers. And throughout the 60s, I mean, there was one drummer who played on 200 hits, chart hits, with everyone from sort of the Kinks to Herman's Hermits and all the rest of that. They all had session drummers.
Right.
And what George Martin said to Brian was, by the way, sort of when after the audition, he says, by the way, when you come next, he says, I may need a session drummer because, it's different in the studio. We need a certain sound in the studio, and we usually use session drummers. And the one they used had actually already been doing sessions for Parlophone. So it wasn't anything to do with Pete's ability as a drummer.
Right.
Because George Martin actually said at the time he thought he was a great advantage to the group.
Right. But they made that decision as a professional move to bring in a different drummer. And
no, I think it was more personal than professional.
It was definitely a personal.
There was nothing wrong with Pete Best as the drummer. In fact, Pete Best played more hours with the Beatles on stage than Ringo Starr did.
Right.
In the whole career, because if you take out all the sort of 4 to 5 hours a night in Hamburg, all the gigs in Liverpool, for a couple of years, sometimes doing 2 or 3 gigs a night, and all that. And when Ringo joined them and they started doing the tours, they were doing these little 20-minute spots.
Right.
So the actual hours, somebody calculated that Pete actually played more hours on stage with the Beatles than Ringo.
Wow. I mean, that is the time that they spent in Germany. I mean, that a lot of time, and what's interesting about it is that I read that the Beatles had made that decision to get Pete out of the group, and other people had known that the Beatles wanted Pete out of the group. Were you made aware by John or Paul prior to Pete being taken out of the group that they wanted to get rid of him, that they were unhappy?
No, not at all. It came as a surprise to me because Brian Epstein, once Brian took them over, he kept trying to keep everything secret. I mean, I'd still go out with the boys drinking and get stories and things like that.
Right.
But Brian obviously was very, very careful, and suddenly, to him, I was the press in a way.
Right.
And when he found that John had given me all these photographs taken in Hamburg, John standing on the corner of the Reaper Bomb in his underpants reading a newspaper,
right,
and Paul sitting on the toilet, when he found out that I'd got all these pictures, he had John rush up to the office and plead with me to give him the photographs back, which I did.
Right.
And Brian started making all these typed out notes. Do not swear on stage, do not smoke on stage, do not take any requests from the audience, and this and that and the other. He took them to the Empire Theatre to see the Shadows group, who bowed at the end of their act, and he said, that's what you have to do, bow at the end of your act.
Wow.
See, he was transforming the group from John Lennon's group into Paul McCartney's group in a way.
Right.
Because Paul loved all this, and John hated it.
Right, it seems like a little bit of a kind of conforming to this professional image that suited Brian Epstein's kind of approach to handling, I guess, bands and professionalism. I guess it's interesting. What Brian always kind of remained in the background as the Beatles got bigger and bigger. How would you describe Brian as an individual? He was a few years older than the guys and had a status because of having NEMS. How would you describe him as a human being?
Well, Brian was very strange. He'd be very nice with us at first. He used to come up to the office, and if he'd been on sort of for a weekend in Amsterdam, he'd drop in the office and give Virginia my girlfriend who became my wife. He'd give her a box of chocolate liqueurs and things. And on his birthday, he invited me and Virginia and Bob Wooler, the Cavern DJ, to have lunch with him on his birthday. He took us to the Hanover restaurant and things. And, there was very close communication sort of initially.
Right.
And of course, but then he wanted to start to control things, control everything which went out with the Beatles and things, which I can understand how in some ways, and of course, because the entire media in Britain was completely controlled from London and Manchester, and it was run by people a generation above us, who didn't understand our musical revolution.
Right.
And Brian had to change them from the rough, raw, savage R&B group that they were, the savage young Beatles. He changed them into the lovable mop tops.
Right.
And he could only do that in order to get them on television and on radio and on the tours. Because in their savage wildness that they had in Hamburg and Liverpool, they wouldn't have been accepted.
Right.
And because of that, it was Andrew Luke Oldham who turned down the job of being PR to the Beatles, because he thought, now that the Beatles have made it, we can do the opposite. And he created an image for the Rolling Stones.
Right.
Now, while the Beatles were in Hamburg playing to gangsters and prostitutes and taking drugs and getting drunk every night, Mick Jagger was at the London School of Economics, and Brian Jones was in the Cheltenham, the nice floral place, and the rest of them were their home counties, the Rolling Stones. And that was a manufactured image of the Stones, which amuses me now when people say, we like the Stones, they were the true R&B and the Beatles were just the lovable mop top.
Right.
And John Lennon hated he said the Rolling Stones have stolen our image, and he was furious, but they had to do that because they were trailblazers.
Right. And it's kind of odd that they basically reversed roles, if you will. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And Mersey Beat lasted several years throughout this whole period when they became the biggest group in England, and then beyond. And how did you find the time to write and contribute to this magazine, distribute it, do it, all of the legwork required?
I did everything with that, the writing, the designing, and I was doing sort of designs for all the Brian Epstein did the poster for him, Alan Williams did drawings for him for his promotion, same with Sam Leach and different people, but basically, I'd work up to 100 hours. Sometimes I'd collapse in the office and they'd have to take me to hospital. Sometimes I'd suddenly come out all bleeding in the nose, which had never stopped. Other times the ambulance had to take me when my back went when I was interviewing the Blue Jeans. I'd be working in the office till 4 o'clock in the morning, and then I'd go down to the pier head to get a pie and a cup of tea from the stand there,
Right.
And it was 7 days a week, just non-stop work. But it's the same when I came down to London and took over all the groups, everything from David Bowie to Led Zeppelin, the Kinks, the Hollies, and all those. And that was it. Me and Virginia were out 7 nights a week for well over something like 15 years, 18 years.
That absolutely, and I gotta not to digress, but you look great for your age now, and you wouldn't even know that you worked that hard because you look so healthy and together. So I was gonna ask you now. You've had in the early '60s. You were in the center of this scene, this giant thing that basically a gift to the rest of the world, and you had such a reputation. And I had read that at a point when Bob Dylan came to England, that he asked to have a tour guide, and you were appointed to take Bob Dylan around Liverpool. Is that correct?
Oh, yes. Well, what happened? I'd gone down to London to see the press conference he was having, And I'd known Al Aronovitz, a friend of Bob's, when he from the Saturday Evening Post when he come to Liverpool. So when I went to I could see that Bob Dylan was getting a bit off with people. He looked bored and things. I went up to her and I said, "Oh, Al Aronovitz asked me to say hello." And he said, "Oh, Al, blah 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 blah." We started talking. I said, "Well, a friend of John's." I said, "Let's go out." And I took him out into the hotel and got John Lennon on the phone and put John onto him. And John invited him to his place in Weybridge and that. So we were chatting away, and Bob was asking me all about poets and poetry and everything like that. And he said, "Look, when I go to Liverpool, I want you to take me around." So after his show, we went to the Adelphi Hotel where he was staying, and he said, "Right, take me around." So we took him to the Jacaranda Club, and they met Mike McCartney and Roger McGough.
Right.
The poets, because Roger McGough became Britain's major poet in the 60s anyway.
Right.
And then we all went back to the hotel, and throughout the whole night were... the reason why we went back to the hotel, that was it, because I said to Bob, I'd like to get you a drink, what would you like? And he said, Beaujolais. But with the bar, the Blue Angel only served beer and spirits. So we said, they got no Beaujolais. He said, well, let's all go back to the hotel. So we all went back to the hotel with me, Virginia, Mike McCartney, Roger McGough, and he brought along a girl trio called the Poppies. And we went into Dylan's suite, and he had a table, and there's a whole crate of Beaujolais on the table. So we spent the whole night chatting, and Bob was going on to me about this book he'd written called Tarantula, and he was all excited about it and everything like that. So it was quite an interesting time, that.
Right. And what do you remember what year that was?
I think it was the year when... it must have been, it's around the 64, 65 period. I think it was 64, wasn't it?
Wow, yeah, I mean, it seems very, very early. And at that point, Bob had not met John Lennon at that point. Only just spoken to him on the phone?
I got him on the phone. They knew each other, yes, I think they had met.
Oh, okay.
Or they certainly knew each other. It's when I phoned John at his Weybridge place, they all got Bob Dylan in, and I just handed the phone over to Bob.
That's
and it's like at the end. It's all the interesting things that happened over the years. I mean, like with Bobby Darin. Now, when Bobby Darin came over to England, he wouldn't do any interviews at all. He refused to do interviews. He didn't like interviews and things, type of things being written about him. But Frank Fencer from Polydor Records, a friend of mine, talked Dylan into giving an interview for me, because I was writing for Record Mirror, Music Now, Weekend Magazine,
right.
Music Week, and all these different publications. And so Bob's... PA Tommy invited me to meet Bobby Darin at the Claridge's Hotel. So I went there and started chatting, and we got on quite well. Then when the article was published, I got a call from Tommy again. He says, Bobby'd like you to come down and meet him again at Claridge's. So I went down there, and Bobby says, this is the best article that has ever been written about me. And he says, I'm here doing a film premiere, Strangers in the House, it was called. A different title was taken in America, but it was a film he did with James Mason and Geraldine Chaplin. And he said, look, he says, I've got to go to the actual premiere, but I'm not going to the party afterwards because I'd like to take you and Virginia out for dinner.
Wow.
So he took us out for dinner to the most fantastic Italian restaurant. And decorate on the walls, an acoustic guitar. He asked them to take it down, and he played us 18 Yellow Roses and things.
Wow.
Then he said, look, I've just rented this nice house in London, and I want you to stay with me. So we went to live with Bobby for a while at his place, and he said, look, I'm going to France, to Paris, and I want to take you with me, because I'll introduce you to Marlon Brando, and some other sort of friends of mine.
Right.
Danny Kay, and we thought it was great. So we all went to the airport, and it was all foggy and terrible fog there, as it used to be in the 60s. So he took us to the Holiday Inn, and we had a meal and a laugh, because he was such an amusing character,
Right.
And of course, the planes couldn't go because of the fog, so we missed out on that nice Paris trip.
Oh, that's always how that goes too. Yeah. And so you just to catch up, you ended up obviously, you mentioned earlier doing a lot of press work for a lot of huge groups. And how the transition from going, I know that you had the Mersey Beat. You went to London. You were to write with for a national paper with Brian, and that didn't work out. How did you make the transition?
Brian wanted me to run a national music paper, so I came up with the name Music Echo and started doing that. Now he'd promised me, sort of editorial freedom, but he kept interfering and doing things which were so naff. I knew the thing was heading for doom.
Right.
So I said to Brian, look, that's it, I'm out. And I went to Manchester to handle PR for a number of groups. Then I took over the management of a group called the Four Pennies, who had a #1 hit. And then I went to London with them. And then I started writing for all the papers. Then I was asked to become PR for the Kinks and the Hollies.
Right.
And it just went on from then. 2 young students had come down from Newcastle. They'd been left a bit of money. And they had all these unknown groups. So I took them all over. Jethro Tull, 10 years after.
Wow.
All those for them. Chicken Shack with Christine Perfect.
Right.
And then it just went on then with their publicity. Procol Harum, and David Bowie, Led Zeppelin, Susie Quattro. Sort of. I did about 40 bands over 18 years.
Wow, and the work that that's involved in doing this kind of PR for these groups. What kind of? I mean, this was for magazines for all over the place. Give me a little bit of background into that.
Very, very hard in the 60s. I mean, in the 60s, the national newspapers did not want to know pop groups.
Right.
They'd write about the Beatles or the Stones, and actually they were quite nasty with the Stones at times, but it was they would only write sort of almost scandalous stories. And but the thing is, I used to do all kinds of angles which seemed to appeal to them, and I got to know very closely the showbiz reporters of the major newspapers like the Daily Mirror and Daily Express.
Right.
But the thing is, people had to do gimmicks. You couldn't get anything unless you came up with a gimmick, for stories of the papers, like Screaming Lord Sutch, for instance, would be driven in a chariot by 2 topless ladies to give a letter to the number 10 Downing Street. Another group would ride on an elephant to deliver their latest record to the BBC. And, so there were all these kind of things that you had to do. For example, when I took over a group called Nazareth, they were completely unknown. So I thought, I've got to get the people to know them, to get intimate with them so they like the lads. So what I do, the Hollies had once taken us frequently to the Nell Gwyn strip club. And I found that the Nell Gwyn strip club was having a naked pantomime for Christmas. So I decided to rent the naked pantomime and invite all the people from the press and the disc jockeys and everybody.
Right.
And people were saying, like, some of the top DJs and people, they'd never turn up there. Particularly John Peel, who people regarded as one of the best disc jockeys.
Right.
And in fact, it was the most crowded reception of the whole year, and he was in the front row. And then also with them, what I'd done, their manager had this flat in central London, so I got somebody to get the cameras in, projectors, and I rented all these unusual Russian science fiction films, like Planet of Berg.
Wow.
And I invited the press guys around, had a stock full of beer for the whole night, so people could wander around, meet the group, watch the films, have some booze, things like that.
Right.
You know?
You were throwing these incredible parties to make a really huge impression on the rest of the industry, and by which taking these bands and giving them a introduction.
Yeah.
It seems like it's such an interesting way. And how did you, Led Zeppelin being one of the hugest groups in the 70s, and not one to necessarily have a lot of press written about them, they didn't do much press. How did your involvement with Led Zeppelin come about?
Well, Peter Grant, I'd known their manager for a long time. We were good friends, and he says, "Look, I want you to do the press, and the thing is, that means no press.
Right.
I don't want them to do interviews. I want you to keep the press away from them." So when I was doing Led Zeppelin, I had to keep them away from the press. And in fact, during that time, I think they only did one TV show because he was turning down TV shows and everything.
Right.
And the method he had seemed to work. I travelled all around with them all the time, you know, to the open air concerts they gave. I travelled with them to Europe. I travelled with them to America, and you know, it was just that, and it was quite amazing that no press became great press as far as they were concerned.
Right.
I mean, and there were all kinds of escapades and stories that happened that you could never believe.
I can only imagine.
Yeah, I remember one time with Bonzo. I was PR for all the London clubs like Revolution, Speakeasy, Blazers, Tiles. You know, I was PR for all those as well. And Revolution was one where, you know, everyone, Frank Sinatra and Bridget Bardot and all people like that would be regularly down and things. And it was there sort of one night, and they said, "There's a phone call from you," and it was Bonham. Bonzo.
Right.
And he says, "I want to come and have a drink with you." I said, "Fine, I'm here at the Revolution now."
That's a challenge, too.
I said, "Where are you?" He said, "Birmingham." I said, "Birmingham?" I said, I'm at the Revolution in London. You'd never get it. I said, "The bar shuts at 2 o'clock. And he said, "Well, I want a drink. I'm coming." So we're sitting there, and at 10 to 2 he arrived. And he ordered us 50 lagers. It's all right, we did them.
Wow. Wow. John Bonham, obviously, probably one of, if not one of the greatest rock and roll drummers that have ever lived. Such and passed away very early on.
No, yeah. It was great. You know, it was great. I mean, I used to go drinking with Keith Moon as well.
Yeah.
We used to go to these afternoon drinking clubs in London, like the Cottage and things. And he used to get up to all sorts of mischief as well.
I can imagine.
And he went early. And I think the thing is, it wasn't drugs that was the thing with the British groups in the 60s. It was alcohol.
Right.
Booze. And they drank to... that's what caused me to finish with Led Zeppelin. Because I was in a pub, the Coach and Horses, conducting an interview with Susie Quattro. Then also, I had a member of Glenn Cornick of Jethro Tull who was had an interview in my office. And when I saw Bonzo, together with Stan Weber, Chicken Shack, and a few other rascals at the bar, they used to sort of tell the barmaid to get a big glass, put Quanto in, brandy, things like that. They'd have all these exotic drinks and get real drunk. And I was trying to conduct an interview, and Bonzo was so drunk, he came over and ripped a pocket off my pants, and all my money went everywhere. And I'd got so fed up of the escapade,
right,
that I said, "Right, don't come near me again. I'm having nothing to do with you." And I phoned Peter Grant and said, "I'm not having anything more to do with Led Zeppelin."
Wow.
I mean, it was all right when we're in restaurants like the Speakeasy, plates of spaghetti come floating through the air and things like that.
Right.
But, you know, when I'm trying to conduct other things, you know, other business with people and give other artists their due and let them get interviewed, you know, it's a bit too much, you know.
Oh, of course.
So they got another PR. who had a lovely green velvet suit, and as soon as they saw him, they threw him in a swimming pool, fully dressed.
I can imagine the amazing stories.
Yes, there are things I can't tell.
I can imagine. You know, and you now to talk a little bit. I mean, you've been a writer for pretty much almost all of your life. On one way or another, you've contributed to at least over 20 books, or written on your own, or contributed with other writers, authors. Do you have a plan or a definitive, plan to release some of the stories that you've not yet shared?
Yes, well, I'm writing sort of books now. The thing is to find a publisher, because the publishing industry has changed.
Right.
You know? But some of the books I have got things in it that nobody's ever heard of before, or I've got one book about John Lennon, which is completely different from anything that's ever been written before.
I bet.
But it's a matter, though I've had 29 books published, it's very difficult now to get a book published in Britain unless you have an agent, because in all the years I've been writing books, I've never had an agent.
Wow.
And nowadays, publishers in Britain will only deal with agents.
Right.
If I approach them now, they say, you have to have an agent. They won't even look at the proposal.
Wow. I mean, that's incredible considering your, prolific output. You know what I mean? It just seems like people would be lining up to get a book from you, I would think.
Who's a better source?
I know,
Who's
exactly.
a better source than this guy?
Yes. I think about that because in documentaries, interviews that you've given, just the insight of course of being there, but also just being able to see this. I mean, it's almost as if. I mean, did you take a lot of notes, a lot of this as you were going on and chronicling this in the Mersey Beat? You must have had such a collection of notes to keep all the bands and band members, managers. I mean, it's overwhelming information.
In my office now, I've got about 40 boxes absolutely crammed with information, stuff, stories, things like that, because the stuff I've been collecting for over 50 years.
Wow. Absolutely incredible. Another thought of mine was, because of your wealth of knowledge, and in modern times with the computer and podcasts, it almost seems that you could do a weekly program and just pick a topic and go and have a wonderful series.
Oh, sure, because I can pick angles that's not been done before, say about the Beatles.
Right.
And I can associate the Beatles with everything from interstellar flight to Adolf Hitler to soap operas, you name it, to nudity,
right, to
Judaism, you name it, and I can get so many facts on them that people don't generally know.
Absolutely amazing, and I know I don't want to take up too much of your time. But I do want to ask a couple small questions with your throughout your career, as you were very, very close with the Beatles, John and the rest of the guys, and as they were making these heights with their career, and they kept in contact with you. Was there a point where you were obviously going with your life and going in a direction with your work? Were you still maintaining a friendship as the Beatles got bigger and as they eventually broke up? Did you still remain in contact with the guys?
Sure, because what happened in London, when I was doing all these other acts and other things, obviously they took my time. So I didn't interview the Beatles or do anything once I was in London.
Right.
But I always used to go to Apple. And Derek used to invite me up there to play me the previews of their latest releases and things.
Right.
And I'd go to things, be invited to things like the Apple Christmas party. I'd go in and there would be Caleb, the tarot reader, doing his readings and the things,
Right.
and then in the corner there'd be a girl breastfeeding her baby, and then there'd be a couple of Hell's Angels there smashing people up, and I'd wander upstairs in the room, and there was only two people in there, Mother and Father Christmas, and that's when John first introduced me to Yoko, you know.
Right.
But we used to meet in the clubs. Originally, we'd be in clubs like the Scots St. James, and then they'd be coming to the Speakeasy, they'd come into the Revolution. So I'd see them at Apple and at the clubs and things. But it was purely on a friendship basis, and
Right.
not to do interviews or do things like that, you know?
Right, of course. And did they ever at any point kind of treat you a little bit in the he's our friend, but he is also from the press, or was it always friendship first with those guys?
No, it was just the friendship first. I don't think they treated me as a press person as such. Brian Epstein was the only one who did that.
Right.
Because when he took them over, it was as if he had to have a barrier between the Beatles and the press. He wanted to control everything.
Right.
But in actual fact, I was still seeing them and still drinking with them, and you know, I mean, for instance, I was with when I was drinking one night with John at the Blue Angel, and I said, John, you know, Beryl Marsden, she was the best girl singer in Liverpool. I said, have you got any number you can give to Beryl? And he said, sure. He said, there's one number I think will suit her called Love of the Loved. And he said, Beryl can have that. So I saw Beryl and said, oh, John said they've got a number for you. And then when I was drinking again with John a few days later, he said, oh, Bill, I'm sorry. He says that when I mentioned it to Brian Epstein, he got furious and says, he's the manager. He will decide who will have their songs, and we're not to give it to Beryl, you know?
Wow.
So he wanted complete and utter control.
Right. And it sounds like he had the authority and power to try to take the Beatles and basically protect them and do and drive him in the direction he wanted to go into.
Exactly. Yeah. That was it. Yeah.
And that's it's such a fascinating insights. Bill, I want to thank you, by the way, for taking the time out. I could have you on the program.
I could listen to Bill all day.
I was going to
really
say
could.
I could have you on the program every other couple of weeks, and we could talk. It's such a fascinating. You've got a website for Mersey Beat, the Mersey-Beat.com.
That's right.
And Merseybeat.com has got it's got some of the articles, photographs from the original run, and a lot of information, like an encyclopedia of that time. Is there other information, other books in the works that you are working on now?
Sure, I've been working on an extended version of my Beatles encyclopedia. I had it first published in 1994, and I've been working on it ever since. I had a revised edition in 2002, but it only went to 1,016 pages because the printers couldn't put any more in, so they put an extra 60,000 words out. But I've done so much more, it's got to be 2 big volumes.
Right.
Wow.
And so that's the work. I've been working on that for 25 years.
Wow.
And it's stories and people that nobody's ever heard of, but all related to the Beatles and things.
That sounds fantastic. I mean, that's...
So I've got to get a publisher.
Right. Well, any help I can do, I will do it. I mean, that is, it sounds incredible, and I just it is such an absolute honor to be able to
Such an honor
to have you on the program and to listen to some of the greatest stories, and to have worked with some of the most I guess the biggest and most amazing rock and roll groups of the 20th century. It just absolutely, we're blessed that you have been doing the work that you've been doing for your entire life, and I cannot thank you enough for taking your time out today.
Well said, Eddie.
Yes.
Well, that's been sort of great, Eddie and Bodie. I've quite enjoyed this, a nice chat. But we're only lightly touched the surface when I think about all those sort of years. I mean, the PR side of it alone was 18 years.
Right.
So many things happened.
I would love. I mean, maybe in the new year, maybe we can check back in and do some do a follow up and talk a little bit more in depth about
Yes,
some of
that'd be
these
fine.
things. It would be fantastic.
Amazing. That would be amazing.
Yeah, we would love to do that. Bill, I want to thank you once again for being on the program, and we'll stay in touch. And again, I'll post up the website for merseybeat.com on our website. And
Oh, that's great.
and I wish you all the best. I hope that you do get the 2 volumes out, because that is going to be a sensational reading, and it needs to be out there.
Absolutely.
So thank you so much, Bill, and
thank you so
for,
much.
Yeah, and thank you for your time today.
Okay, I appreciate chatting with you. You've been nice.
Thank you very much. You've been
Okay.
great. Take care as always. Thank you very much, Bill Harry.
All right.
Thank you.
Bye.
What a
Bye-bye.
wonderful human being.
Ladies and gentlemen, Bill Harry all the way.